From translation, TLB the Living Bible this 121 day of the year. Today we are reading passages 1 Chronicles 3-5, 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 1 to 24. These were David's sons who were born to him in Hebron. The oldest was Amnon, whose mother was Ahinoam of Jezreel. The second was Daniel, whose mother was Abigail of Carmel. The third was Absalom, whose mother was Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth was Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith. The fifth was Shephatiah, whose mother was Abital. The sixth was Ithream, whose mother was Eglah, David's wife. These 6 sons were born to David in Hebron, where he reigned for 7 years. Then he reigned in Jerusalem for 33 more years, and these were the children born to him there: Shimea, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon. These 4 were born to him by Bathsheba, the daughter of Ammiel. There were also 9 other sons: Ibhar, Elishu, Eliphelet, Noga, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. All these were David's sons, besides those whose mother was his concubine Tamar. These were the sons of David's concubines, Tamar, Maacah, and Abigail. And Tamar bore him 2 sons, Shimea and Jonathan. Maacah bore Shephatiah and Japhia. Abigail bore Amnon and Zabad. Solomon's son was Rehoboam, who had Abijah, then Asa, then Jehoshaphat, then Joram, then Ahaziah, then Joash, then Amaziah, then Azariah, then Jotham. Jotham's son was Ahaz, then Hezekiah, then Manasseh, then Ammon, then Josiah. Josiah's sons were Johanan, Jehoiakim, Zedekiah, and Shallum. Jehoiakim's son was Jehoiachin, then Zedekiah. Jehoiachin's sons were Shealtiel, and Malchiram, Pedaiah, Shenazar, Jechamiah, Hoshama, and Nedaiah. The sons of Jehoiakim were Jehoiachin and Zedekiah. The sons of Jehoiachin were Shealtiel and Malchiram, Pedaiah, Shenazar, Jechamiah, Hoshama, and Nedaiah. The sons of Pedaiah were Zerubbabel and Shimei. Zerubbabel had Meshullam, and Hananiah, and Shelemith their sister. Hashubah, Ohul, Berechiah, Hasadiah, and Joshapized were Zerubbabel's sons. The sons of Hananiah were Pelatiah and Jeshiah. The sons of Raphiah were Arnan. The sons of Obadiah were Shechaniah. The sons of Shechaniah were Shemaiah. And the sons of Shemaiah were Hattush, Igal, Bariah, Neriah, and Shaphat. The sons of Neriah were Elionai, Hizkiah, and Azrikam. The sons of Elionai were Hodaviah, Eliashib, Peliah, Akub, Johanan, Deliah, and Anani. These were the family heads of the descendants of David, through the line of Solomon, down to the time of King Jeconiah. The sons of Jeconiah were Asiah, Shealtiel, Malchiram, Pedaiah, Shenazar, Jechamiah, Hoshama, and Nedaiah. 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 1 to 43. The descendants of Judah were Perez, Hezron, Carmi, Hur, and Shobal. Shobal's son was Reiah, whose son was Jahath, whose son was Ahumai, whose son was Lahad. These were the descendants of Hur, the oldest son of Ephrathah. Hur was the father of Shobal, the father of Kiriath-Jearim. Shobal's brother was Harro, and his son was Bethlehem's founder. The descendants of Hur were the people of Etam, Penuel, and Ezem. The descendants of Hur were also the people of Asher and Tekoa. Asher's son was Tekoa, and his descendants included Helah, Nara, and Gazez. Gazez had Ahahul, the father of Laish. The descendants of Etam were Ziza, Ijar, and Ethan. The descendants of Koz were Anub, Hatsobah, and the clans of Ahahul, the son of Haram. Jabez was a man more honored than his brothers, and his mother named him Jabez, saying, "Because I bore him with pain." Jabez called upon the God of Israel, saying, "Oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my border, and that your hand would be with me, and that you would keep me from evil, that I might not cause pain." And God granted what he asked. Caleb's son was Hur, and Hur's son was Uri. Uri's son was Bezalel, whom the Lord filled with wisdom, understanding, and knowledge for every kind of craftsmanship. Hur was the father of Abiel, and Abiel was the father of Shammah. Shammah was the father of Raham, and Raham was the father of Jorkom. The descendants of Caleb were Elah, son of Mezahab, and a daughter named Jerioth. Caleb's descendants included Jerahmeel, Sheshan, and Marth. The sons of Kenaz were Othniel and Sariah. Othniel's son was Hassas. Meonotai was the father of Ophrah. Sariah was the father of Joab, the father of Jeharashim, a village of craftsmen. The sons of Caleb were Elah and Naam. Elah's son was Kenaz. The descendants of Yael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, were Sisera, Jether, and Uzziah. The descendants of Jerahmeel were the firstborn: Ram, Bunah, Oren, Ozem, and Ahijah. The descendants of Ram were Mars, Jamin, and Eker. The descendants of Jamin were Joshaphat and Jehodan. The descendants of Eker were Ziz and Ethan. The descendants of Ethan were Azariah, Jehozabad, and Joel. The descendants of Azariah were Heber, Ishmael, and Ishijah. The descendants of Heber were Ziza and Jalon. The descendants of Ziza were Jewel and Ziza. The descendants of Jalon were Ram and Amminadab. The descendants of Amminadab were Nahshon. The descendants of Nahshon were Salmon, and the descendants of Salmon were Boaz. The descendants of Boaz were Obed, and the descendants of Obed were Jesse, whose son was David. The descendants of Jesse were Eliab his oldest son, then Abinadab, then Shimea, and then Nethanel, then Radai and Ozem and David. The sons of Azubah were Jether and Ishmael. The descendants of Jether were Jeshua, and the descendants of Ishmael were Shemaiah, and the descendants of Shemaiah were Rehabiah, and the descendants of Rehabiah were Aram, and the descendants of Aram were Caleb, and the descendants of Caleb were Hur, and the descendants of Hur were Uri, and the descendants of Uri were Bezalel. The descendants of Shemaiah were Hattush, Igal, Bariah, Neariah, and Shaphat, 6 in all. These were the descendants of Hebron, who was a descendant of Judah. Hebron had 4 sons, Jerahmeel, Ram, Caleb, and Ozi. Jerahmeel was the father of Gilead. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz. Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David. The descendants of Simeon were Nemuel, Jamin, Jarib, Zerah, and Shaul. The descendants of Shaul were Shemaiah, and then Nadab, and then Jewel, and then Ziza, and then Eshtobah, and then Saul, and then Bineah, and then Raphiah, and then Elisa, and then Azel. The descendants of Azel were Jeshua. And the descendants of Jeshua were Eliashib, and the descendants of Eliashib were Penuel, and the descendants of Penuel were Uzi, and the descendants of Uzi were Jehonathan, and the descendants of Jehonathan were Zakkai, and the descendants of Zakkai were Meshullam, and the descendants of Meshullam were Shimei, and the descendants of Shimei were Jehudah. And the descendants of Jehudah were Jonathan, and the descendants of Jonathan were Antothijah, and the descendants of Antothijah were Uzziah. The descendants of Shimei were Shemaiah, and the descendants of Shemaiah were Hattush, and the descendants of Hattush were Igal, and the descendants of Igal were Bariah, and the descendants of Bariah were Regem, and the descendants of Regem were Attai. And the descendants of Attai were Orzi, and the descendants of Orzi were Zerd, and the descendants of Zerd were Ethai, and the descendants of Ethai were Ziza, and the descendants of Ziza were Adiah, and the descendants of Adiah were Rohob, and the descendants of Rohob were Hanan, and the descendants of Hanan were Shammai, and the descendants of Shammai were Shemaiah. And the descendants of Shemaiah were Ishi, and the descendants of Ishi were Zelhad, and the descendants of Zelhad were Jala, and the descendants of Jala were Ziph, and the descendants of Ziph were Zoe, and the descendants of Zoe were Josh, and the descendants of Josh were Saraph, who married the Moabites, and the descendants of Saraph were Jabez, and the descendants of Jabez were Othniel. Sariah and Joab, they lived in Beersheba, Moladah, Hazar-Shual, Bilhah, Ezem, and Tolad. They also lived in Bethuel, Hormah, Ziklag, and Beth-Marcaboth. And they lived in Hazor, in Shushan, in Beth-Peor, in Asherim, and in other towns throughout the region of Bashan. They also lived in all the villages around these towns as far as Baalath. These were their settlements and genealogical records. The descendants of Simeon, 500 in all, leaders of their clans, went to live in the region of Mount Seir. They had destroyed the last of the Amalekites, and they have lived there ever since. The settlements of the tribe of Simeon were Beersheba, Moladah, Hazar-Shual, Bilhah, Ezem, and Tolad. They also lived in Bethuel, Hormah, Ziklag, Beth-Marcaboth, Hazar-Susa, Beth-Biri, and Sharim. These were their cities until the reign of David. Their other settlements were Etam, Ain, Rimmon, Token, and Ashan, 5 cities, along with all their surrounding villages. These settlements were in the territory allotted to the tribe of Judah. The following were the leaders of their clans: Meshabab, Jamlech, Joshua, the son of Amaziah, Joel, Jehu, and Ben-Johanan. The following were the leaders of the clan of Simeon: Shemaiah, then Deliah, then Joachim, then Zebediah, and then Marcia. They also lived in Ajalon and in Shalban and Bethshemesh, and in their surrounding villages. From their clan they extended to the east as far as the edge of the valley, looking for pasture for their flocks. They found rich, good pasture, and the land was spacious, quiet, and peaceful, but the people who lived there before were descendants of Ham. In the days of King Hezekiah of Judah, some of the descendants of Simeon invaded the region and completely destroyed the homes of the descendants of Ham and the Munites, as they had been told to do by the prophets. They destroyed their homes and settled there, because there was good pasture for their flocks. They also destroyed the last of the Munites who were still living in that region. 500 of these Simonites, led by Pelasha, Neariah, Raphiah, and Uzziel, all sons of Ishi, invaded the hill country of Seir and completely destroyed the last of the Amalekites who were still living there. 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verses 1 to 26. The sons of Reuben, Israel's oldest son, were Hanok, Pulu, Hezron, and Carmi. The genealogical records show that Reuben was the firstborn, but his rights as the firstborn were taken away because he defiled his father's bed. Joseph received the rights of the firstborn instead, giving him a double portion of the inheritance. So the rights of the firstborn belonged to Joseph. Judah was the strongest of the tribes and became their leader, but the rights of the firstborn belonged to Joseph. The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, were Hanok, Pulu, Hezron, and Carmi. The descendants of Joel were Shemaiah, who was the son of Gog, who was the son of Shimei, who was the son of Micah, who was the son of Jediael, who was the son of Rehabiah, who was the son of Eleazar, who was the son of Joel. The descendants of Shemaiah were Jath, Shemaiah, and then Jehozabad, and then Jeshuhiah, and then Shallum, and then Amzi, and then Bani, and then Remel, and then Jesamiel, and then Bunniah, and then Shimei, and then Jozabad, and then Jeshuhiah, and then Anathoth, and then Elimeth, and then Micah, and then Meshullam, and then Hezem, and then Shual. The descendants of Bera were Zechariah, who was the leader of the Reubenite tribe when they were exiled by King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria. His relatives were Jael, Zechariah, and Bela. Bela's son was Azaz, who had Aram, and Arod, and Arel. Arod's son was Aminadab, and Aminadab's son was Michal. Michal's son was Elisaphan, and Elisaphan's son was Jeremoth, and Jeremoth's son was Jardo, and Jardo's son was Ziza, and Ziza's son was Shimei, and Shimei's son was Jo, and Jo's son was Jozabad, Jozabad's son was Immer, and Immer's son was Penuel, and Penuel's son was Elimeth, and Elimeth's son was Asmaveth, and Asmaveth's son was Zimri, and Zimri's son was Moser, and Moser's son was Bineah, and Bineah's son was Raphiah, and Raphiah's son was Elisa, and Elisa's son was Azel, and Azel's son was Sheshan, and Sheshan's son was Arli, and Arli's son was Jair, and Jair's son was Ethnan, and Ethnan's son was Jasau, and Jasau's son was Jarha, and Jarha's son was Asahel, and Asahel's son was Meshullam, and Meshullam's son was Zikri, and Zikri's son was Shelemith, and Shelemith's son was Jair, and Jair's son was Eshtemoa, and Eshtemoa's son was Ara, and Ara's son was Naaman, and Naaman's son was Shallum, and Shallum's son was Ahijah, and Ahijah's son was Baal, and Baal's son was Bera, and Bera's son was Tiglath-Pileser, who took the Reubenites, Gadites, and half-tribe of Manasseh into exile. The eastern settlements of the Reubenites were along the desert edge from the Euphrates River to the eastern edge of the wilderness. Their livestock multiplied throughout the land of Gilead. During the days of Saul, they fought the Hagrites and defeated them. The descendants of Reuben lived in the land until the exile. The descendants of Gad lived next to the Reubenites in the land of Bashan as far as Salcah. Joel was the leader, Shapham was next, then Jarnai, and Shaphat, who was the chief of the clan of Shapham. Their relatives were Shemaiah, who was the son of Hushim, who was the son of Abitub, who was the son of Zur, who was the son of Jerahmeel, who was the son of Jardo, who was the son of Jedor, who was the son of Ahio, who was the son of Shaphat, who was the son of Bineah, who was the son of Jehoshaphat, who was the son of Shemaiah, who was the son of Kimmam, who was the son of Jonathan, who was the son of Jersham, who was the son of Moses. Their relatives were Michael, Meshullam, Sheba, Jorai, Jachin, Ziza, and Eber. 7 in all. Ahi was the son of Abdiel, who was the son of Guni, who was the son of Jedidiah, who was the son of Shimri, who was the son of Shemaiah, who was the son of Hushim, who was the son of Shemiramoth, who was the son of Obed, who was the son of Jo, who was the son of Ziza, who was the son of Ithran, who was the son of Eder, who was the son of Michael, who was the son of Jeshishai, who was the son of Jardo, who was the son of Buz, who was the son of Abdiel, who was the son of Guni, who was the son of Jedidiah, who was the son of Shimri, who was the son of Shemaiah. The descendants of Gad lived in Bashan, in the villages of its northern regions, and in the plains east of Bashan, as far as the desert that extends to the Euphrates River. Their genealogical records were listed in the history of Jotham, the king of Judah, and in the history of Jeroboam, the king of Israel. The descendants of Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh were skilled soldiers who carried shields and swords, were archers, and were trained for war. They went to war in teams of 40,000, equipped for battle. They fought against the Hagrites, Jeter, Naphish, and Nodab, and because they trusted in God when they went to war, God helped them defeat their enemies. They plundered the Hagrites and all their allies. 50,000 of their best troops were killed in the battle. They seized their livestock, 50,000 camels, 250,000 sheep, 2,000 donkeys, and 100,000 captives. Many were slain, for God fought for them in the battle. So the people of Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh lived in their land until they were taken into exile. The people of Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh were skilled in war. They carried shields and swords, were archers, and were trained for battle. They fought against the Hagrites, Jeter, Naphish, and Nodab, and they defeated them, because they trusted in God when they went to war. The half-tribe of Manasseh received the following land: Bashan, all of Gilead, and the entire land of Argob, which is in the territory of Bashan, with all the 60 large, walled cities. The region of Bashan was formerly called the land of the Rephates. Machir, a descendant of Manasseh, gave rise to the people of Gilead. Machir was the father of Gilead, and Gilead was the father of Jair, who controlled 23 towns in the land of Gilead. But the people of Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh were unfaithful to the God of their ancestors, and chased after the gods of the people of the land, whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel caused King Pul of Assyria, also known as Tiglath-Pileser, to attack the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh. He exiled them to Halah, Habah, Hara, and the Gozan River, where they remain to this day.